He came to humiliate her on live TV, but she came with documents that made him storm off the set. Karoline Leavitt, just 26, faced down Hollywood icon Robert De Niro and exposed a truth he never thought would go public. What she revealed next left the studio silent and a nation rethinking everything. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Karoline Leavitt, 26 years old, wasn't supposed to make it this far. That's what they said when she became the youngest press assistant in the Trump White House. That's what they said when she took the podium and stood her ground against hostile networks. And that's what they said when she accepted a seat at a round table with one of the most outspoken actors in America, Robert De Niro. But Karoline never listened to what they said. She focused on what she could prove. Long before she stepped into that studio, Karoline had faced fire. Mainstream journalists had tried to corner her. Politicians had tried to discredit her. Activists had tried to smear her. But what none of them understood was that she didn't enter politics for applause. She entered it because she believed the truth deserved a defender. And if no one else would do it, she would. So when the producers of American Spotlight invited her to debate De Niro live on air, most people assumed she'd be a convenient target, a young conservative woman cornered on camera by a beloved celebrity and a sympathetic host. But Karoline didn't walk in blind. She walked in ready. Armed with a modest leather portfolio and months of preparation, she took her seat at the far end of the studio desk, alone, calm, underestimated. She wasn't there to argue. She wasn't there to play pundit games. She was there for something bigger. She was there to challenge the contradiction between words and actions, between what famous people preach and how they live. In a political culture ruled by sound bites and personalities, Karoline Leavitt came to make one thing clear. Performance is not integrity. What happened next wasn't scripted. It wasn't expected, but it was unforgettable. Because when she opened that folder, everything changed, and Robert De Niro never saw it coming. The lights dimmed in the studio as the theme music faded. Cameras rolled. Maria Donovan, seated in the center, smiled into the lens with the smooth confidence of someone used to controlling the narrative. To her right, the legendary Robert De Niro adjusted his microphone. To her left, Karoline Leavitt sat poised, hands folded in her lap, expression calm but focused. Tonight, Donovan began, we bring together two very different voices in America's ongoing political conversation. Robert De Niro, award-winning actor and outspoken critic of the Trump administration, and Karoline Leavitt, national press secretary for the Trump campaign. Her tone shifted slightly as she turned toward De Niro. Robert, you've spoken passionately about your concerns for this country. What do you believe is at stake in the next election? The stage was his. De Niro leaned in, voice already rising with the kind of force that made his film roles legendary. We're at a crossroads, he said. Our democracy is under attack. Trump and his enablers, people like this young lady here, they are dismantling the very institutions that protect our freedom. They attack the press, the courts, the truth itself. It frightens me, and it should frighten every American watching tonight. The camera briefly cut to Karoline's face. No flicker of irritation, no visible reaction, just a steady gaze and a quiet presence. De Niro wasn't finished. These people, these apologists, he said, gesturing vaguely toward Karoline without turning to face her. They're either naive or corrupt, maybe both. They're either being used or they know exactly what they're doing. Either way, they're a danger to the country. The audience, clearly stacked in his favor, applauded. Donovan nodded along as if this were a neutral commentary. Then she turned to Karoline. Those are strong words, she said carefully, choosing the phrase to echo De Niro's rhetoric. Do you understand why people see your candidate as a threat to democracy? The question wasn't a question. It was an accusation wrapped in a soundbite. Karoline didn't blink. She didn't shift in her chair. She waited a moment before answering, letting the silence work in her favor. Then in a tone even and measured, she replied, I think it's interesting, she said, how quickly we've moved from policy debates to questioning motives and character. Mr. De Niro is entitled to his views, but millions of Americans support President Trump, not because they're deluded or manipulated, but because they believe in his. Record. She began listing it calmly and clearly record low unemployment before co-historic peace agreements in the Middle East, a focus on border security, economic growth that benefited working-class Americans. Those aren't theories. Those are results. Dyro scoffed loud enough for the microphone to catch. Results like trying to overturn an election, like the Capitol riot. Karoline nodded slightly. January 6th was wrong. No one here defends that. But it's disingenuous to reduce 4 years of policy and achievement to a single tragic day. I'm here to talk about the issues, the economy, security, policy that affects everyday Americans. I'd be happy to discuss any of those, the audience murmured, unsure how to respond. Darrow leaned back, irritated. Donovan jumped in. Many Americans believe those so-called achievements are just a smoke screen that they're used to distract from dangerous rhetoric and authoritarian tendencies. Errol paused, letting the weight of the bias land without directly calling it out. I understand emotions run high, but let's not confuse disagreement with danger. Supporting a candidate you disagree with isn't tyranny, it's democracy. The crowd quieted. Something had shifted. She hadn't come out swinging. She hadn't shouted, but she had held her ground. And more importantly, she was waiting. Because the louder Robert Darrow got, the more personal he became, the closer he walked toward the trap she had quietly set. She didn't need to escalate. He was doing it for her. What none of them knew, not Darrow, not Donovan, not even the audience, was that Karoline Leavitt had brought more than just opinions to that studio. She had brought the receipts and she was about to use them. Robert Darrow was heating up. The more calmly Karoline answered, the more animated he became. His hands moved with emphasis. His voice rose in volume and intensity. At one point he called her deluded, then cynical, then in a moment that drew murmurs from the audience, he labeled her dangerous. Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't break eye contact. And then with quiet precision, she struck. Mr. Darrow, she began, her tone respectful but firm, you've spoken tonight about values, about democracy, equality, and respect for working people. She paused, locking eyes with him across the table. Would you say those values are important to you, not just politically, but personally? Darrow sat straighter. Of course, he said without hesitation. That's why I speak out. That's why I've always spoken out. Karoline nodded as if confirming something. And would you agree that public figures who take moral positions should be willing to live by those same standards in their own lives? Absolutely, Darrow replied, his voice firm. If you talk the talk, you should walk the walk always. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached into her leather portfolio and carefully pulled out a document. The tension in the room shifted instantly. She held it up steady in her hand. I'm glad to hear you say that, she said, because I've been given information that raises questions about whether your private actions align with the public positions you've promoted. Darrow's expression froze. This is a sworn affidavit from Maria Gonzalez, Karoline continued. She worked in your home from 2017 to 2022. While you were publicly advocating for a $15 federal minimum wage, she says you paid her $90 an hour. No benefits, no overtime, and you required her to sign a non-disclosure agreement to keep her silent about the conditions. Gasps echoed across the audience. Darrow's eyes darted to the host. His lips parted slightly, but he said nothing. Karoline set the next document on the desk. This is from the IRS filings of Tribeca Enterprises, your production company. While you've called for higher taxes on the wealthy, this paperwork shows your company has routed profits through offshore entities in the Cayman Islands to reduce your own tax burden. The crowd, once murmuring in support of Darrow, had gone completely quiet. Darrow tried to interject. That's a political hit job. This is a smear campaign. Karoline didn't raise her voice. She didn't take the bait. She held her next page and asked simply, Are you denying the information is accurate? Darrow hesitated. Donovan, the host, jumped in quickly, trying to steer the conversation back. Let's focus on the larger political picture. Maybe we can save this for another time. Karoline shook her head. He made this about values, about who deserves to be trusted and who should be dismissed. And I think Americans deserve to know if the people lecturing them are living by their own standards. Darrow's face was visibly strained. The usual confidence, the righteous energy had shifted into something more defensive. He glanced towards someone off stage, perhaps a publicist, perhaps a producer, but no one came to his rescue. Carolyn turned one more page. These are testimonials from production assistants, young women who worked on your recent film set. They say they endured inappropriate remarks and dismissive treatment while you posted publicly about supporting the Me Too movement and creating safe workspaces. The host tried again to interrupt, but no one was listening. Not the audience, not the crew, not even Dyro, whose shoulders had tightened visibly, jaw clenched. Caroline's voice remained steady. I'm not making accusations. I'm simply presenting facts. Facts that suggest a stark difference between what you say and how you live. Darrow leaned forward, voice lower. Now you don't know what you're talking about. You've been fed lies. She didn't blink. Then say so. Deny it. Deny the documents. Deny the American people that none of this is true. He didn't because he couldn't. And in that moment, the power in the room shifted entirely. Caroline turned to one last sheet of paper in her folder, lifted it gently, and held it up with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the weight of what came next. The studio lights caught the slight shimmer of the printed page as the camera zoomed in. She didn't need theatrics. The truth would do the work for her. This document, she said, her voice still composed, contained signed affidavit from 4 young women who worked as production assistants on your last 2 films. She looked directly at Robert De Niro, whose glare was now less intimidating and more desperate. Where they say, haste women describe an environment of inappropriate remarks, frequent outbursts, and a culture of silence. According to their statements, your on-set behavior didn't reflect the values you so often champion. Respect, equity. Darrow's reaction was immediate. He slammed his hand down on the table so hard that the microphone shook and water glasses trembled. Papers fluttered in place as his voice exploded through the studio. This is outrageous, a disgrace. You think you can come on this show and smear me with lies? This isn't journalism. It's political garbage. The host, Maria Donovan, nearly jumped from her chair, clearly rattled. She glanced nervously at the producers behind the glass, then turned back to the camera. We need to go to commercial. No! Dyro barked, his voice raw with fury. No break. I want to address this now. You let this happen. You brought her here to ambush me. His microphone picked up every word, every ragged breath. The camera crew hesitated, unsure whether to cut or keep rolling. In the control room, the director froze. They were witnessing something no one had predicted. Caroline didn't move. She remained seated, her hands calmly folded on the desk, expression unreadable. Then slowly she turned toward the audience and spoke not to De Niro, not to Donovan, but directly into the camera. I didn't come here to insult Mr. Darrow, she said, her voice steady and free of anger. I came to ask a simple question. Should public figures be held to the same standards they demand of everyone else? There was no applause, no sound at all, just silence. A silence that somehow carried more impact than any shouting ever could. Robert Darrow stood up, ripping off his microphone pack. He looked around the studio as if realizing in that moment that the narrative had slipped out of his control. His chair toppled backward as he stormed off the set. A camera caught the flash of frustration on his face. A boom mic recorded the slam of the studio door behind him. Caroline stayed right where she was. She didn't smirk. She didn't take a victory lap. She didn't say another word. The host sat frozen, her carefully rehearsed script now useless. Behind the glass, the producers scrambled to salvage the broadcast, unsure whether to cut the feed or lean into what had just become a national moment. Carolyn looked once more into the camera. This isn't about left or right, it's about truth versus performance. When people build careers lecturing others about morality, fairness, and justice, it's fair to ask whether they follow those same principles behind the scenes. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The strength was in her stillness. Robert Dyro wants America to believe that he speaks for the common man. But if that's true, the common man deserves to know whether the voice lecturing them is living with the same integrity it demands from others. Millions watched that moment live. Others would see it within hours, clipped, shared, and posted across social media. It wasn't the shouting that went viral. It was the silence, the poise, the precision that was the turning point. Not just for the interview, but for the conversation around celebrity activism in America. Robert De Niro walked off the set. Karoline Leavitt never left her chair. And yet, when the dust settled, there was no doubt who had truly taken the stage. Within hours of the broadcast, the clip had gone viral. Social media exploded with reactions and hashtags like Niro Meltdown, Karoline crushed it, and Truth Over Theater trended across multiple platforms. What began as a standard political segment had turned into a cultural earthquake. Over 20 million people viewed the footage within the first day. Commentators from both sides scrambled to respond. News outlets that typically ignored stories like this were suddenly racing to catch up. The Wall Street Journal released a follow-up report verifying the financial documents Karoline had cited. The New York Times confirmed the wage complaints filed by De Niro's former household staff. The evidence wasn't just real, it was overwhelming. The following morning, Karoline stood before a small podium in the modest lobby of a D.C. hotel. A crush of reporters crowded the room, their microphones extended, their questions loud. Karoline remained composed. Her expression was calm, her voice unwavering. "This was never about tearing down Robert De Niro," she said. "It was about asking a basic question. Do we still care about integrity when the cameras are off? Or are we only interested in performance?" She didn't name-call. She didn't gloat. She stayed consistent with her message. This was about the principle, not the personality, and that clarity made the message harder to dismiss. Even some Democrats found themselves forced to acknowledge what had happened. Congressman Jaime Racine, known for his progressive credentials, offered a statement to reporters. "If we're going to call for ethical standards in public life, then those standards have to apply across the board. You don't get an exemption because you're famous or politically aligned." Karoline's team released a single follow-up post on social media. It read, "Truth isn't partisan. It's just unpopular with the powerful." The reaction was swift. Donations to the Trump campaign spiked. Independent voters began sharing the clip in record numbers. Several left-leaning pundits admitted on air that Karoline had flipped the narrative in a way no one saw coming. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't insulted. She had simply held up facts and asked the kind of questions most interviewers were too afraid to ask. Media outlets that had once mocked her now had no choice but to respect her. She was invited on multiple major platforms, not just to defend Trump, but to speak about media bias, political consistency, and the gap between public image and private behavior. Her appearances were calm, methodical, and impactful. Karoline wasn't a pundit chasing airtime. She was a strategist with a goal, and people noticed. By the end of the week, her social media following had grown by over 800%. Messages flooded her inbox, not just from conservatives, but from independents and even quiet progressives who admitted that something about her approach had pierced the usual noise. Job offers came in, media roles, campaign leadership opportunities, speaking engagements, but Karoline didn't rush to accept them. She was still focused on what had started all, the truth. In Hollywood, the aftershocks were impossible to ignore. Several celebrities quietly canceled their political appearances. 2 fundraising events were postponed indefinitely. Behind closed doors, agents and managers urged their clients to review their own public statements and personal histories. The industry that had once cloaked itself in moral certainty now found itself wrestling with accountability. For Robert De Niro, the fallout was immediate and severe. 2 of his upcoming film projects were quietly shelved. A planned college speaking tour was canceled. Progressive advocacy groups began distancing themselves, removing his name from advisory boards and promotional materials. But Karoline never mentioned him again. She didn't need to. Her actions had already spoken louder than any further commentary. She had entered the studio outnumbered, out-resourced, and underestimated. She walked out of it a national figure, not because she fought dirty, but because she refused to fight on anyone's terms but her own. She hadn't just survived the ambush. She had rewritten the rules of engagement. And in doing so, she reminded America of a truth that too many had forgotten. Sometimes the calloused voice in the room is the one we should listen to most. That night, in living rooms across the country, Americans rewatched the clip. Not for the spectacle of a celebrity losing control, but for the steady presence of someone who refused to back down. They didn't share the moment because a famous actor got angry. They shared it because a 26-year-old woman asked a question that cut deeper than outrage ever could. Do you practice what you preach? Karoline Leavitt didn't point fingers. She didn't shout. She didn't try to dominate the stage. She simply stood her ground and offered what so many in politics and media failed to deliver: consistency. Her calm challenge to Robert De Niro echoed louder than any applause. If you're going to call for higher standards, you should live by them, too. By the end of the week, a quiet shift had taken root. A national poll showed trust in celebrity political endorsements had dropped more than 20%. Voters across the spectrum began questioning not just what public figures say, but how they live. For many, the moment felt like a turning point. Proof that the era of unchallenged moral lectures from the famous and protected might finally be coming to an end. Karoline didn't capitalize on the moment with flashy sound bites. She didn't do a media victory tour or issue scathing statements. She left the studio the same way she entered it, carrying a single leather portfolio, walking quietly past the cameras, and returning to her work without ceremony. Because for her, it was never about being the loudest. It was never about making headlines or humiliating anyone. It was about standing up when it mattered, asking the questions others were too afraid to ask, and trusting that the truth, when spoken with clarity and conviction, could still move people. And it did. If you believe truth matters more than theatrics, subscribe to Impact Stories. Like, comment, and share this video with someone who still believes that integrity should be the baseline, not the exception, for every voice in public life. We'll see you next time with another story of courage that the mainstream would rather keep quiet.